Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out on this snowy day. I hope that it's worth your while. And later on, if you want to, there's tea, chai, black, small, as the lady told me, and there's some quartz, which I'll tell you a little bit about, and some apples, which I'll also explain. But thank you so much for coming out. And so I'll begin. So about a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago, I applied to a program that is offered by the National Consortium for Teaching About Asia, which is this particular, it's a national organization, and this branch is based in Pittsburgh, at the University of Pittsburgh. And so I applied, and I was accepted to the program and received funding to go last summer. And I was fortunate enough then to go with a group, a small group of teachers and professors. Come in, please, we just started. To Central Asia and to the hub of the Silk Roads. And so you probably expected this, but I have to give you a little background about the region. But I'm sure you anticipated that because you know me. So we were going to this region in here, which is right in the center of the ancient Silk Roads. And it's the Silk Roads are not just one path, right? We know this. It's not just one trail. It was a network of trade routes, and people really didn't go all the way across. They would go on certain legs of the network, and it included a north-south access, which involved trade this way that I'll talk about as well. So it's mostly east-west this way, but also some here. And if we look at it on Google Maps today, you can see that this is the region we're talking about. So you've got the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea here, and then Afghanistan and Pakistan, and then we were up here in this really densely labeled region on our trip. So parts of this region were ran right through the Chinese and Russian empires. And when I say the Russian Empire, I mean the Tsarist Empire that spread into Asia in the 19th century. And in modern times, they were divvied up between the Soviets and then the Chinese. And so some parts of this region are still under very strict control of the Chinese, like Xinjiang. So, and again, we're talking about over in there. That is Xinjiang, just off. So we were led, our group of teachers, we were led in most of the countries, of the 4 stans, we were in 3 of them, by our intrepid guide, Lilia, here, who you will see repeatedly. And she is, she's Kyrgyz and speaks English, Russian, and Spanish fluently, incredibly knowledgeable and thorough. And she was just a remarkable resource of somebody to have, very, very, very educated and thoughtful in what she shared with us. So we went on our tour through 4 of the 5 stans, as they're called. So we went to Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. And the borders are a little hard to see here, but you can see this is the route we followed. This is a plane ride, and then we went through here. So we started off in Bishkek, and I will I'll be showing you photos of each region as well. We did not go to Turkmenistan. Now, Turkmenistan remains one of the most closed countries in the world, and so it's very, very hard to get in, to get out. It's very strictly controlled, but so we didn't go there. And at one point, we were 93 miles from Afghanistan and about 200 miles from China. So this really is on the other side of the world. Now, before I begin to trace our journey, I wanted to tell you give you a bit of a historical background. I really can't help myself, I'm sorry. But this is really just a fascinating region. And there are layers and layers of cultures, languages, religions, and politics that have that sometimes are actually literally one on top of the other. My daughter questioned me about if they were actually on top of one another. Yes, at times the sites actually build right on top of one another. And deep down at the base layer, if you sort of think about it as a stack of time, there are the prehistoric origins of the domestication of horses and apples in this region. And since prehistoric times, the mountains and the steppes were home to nomads. These were horse riders who summered and wintered on the steppes. And here, this is near the Songkul Lake, and they stayed like the Mongolians, they worshipped Tengri, the sky god, and left these stone figures behind them. Today, herding people still watch over their horses, their cows, and their yaks. Particularly liked the yaks. And families summer in their yurts, just like we might go to the beach. It's a yurt camp. They stay there. They offer glamping in here. Some of them even have Wi-Fi. And they herd their livestock all summer while children play outside at about 8,000 feet above sea level. In the southern valleys live gardeners and farmers, and they grow today fruit and spices and cotton. And this melon here in the middle, called Collective Farm Melon, apparently is its name, might be the best melon I ever ate. It was really incredibly good. So, now, if we talk about the religious and cultural backgrounds of these regions, they were, since beginning in about the 6th century BCE, this region was Zoroastrian. These are more products from the region, the spices. So this is a Zoroastrian symbol. And these followers used fire in their worship of Ahura Mazda, the god of light, in his struggle against Ahriman, the god of darkness. And they have museum exhibits to these. And some of these practices do persist today. There's one small tribal group in Tajikistan. We did not go there, but I can refer you to books where people have interacted with them, and where they do still practice many of the rituals. But if you ask them directly, oh no, we're Muslim, right? They say they're Muslim. So the region is widely Muslim today. Now there is also this was a Zoroastrian altar. There is also the touch of Alexander the Great, shown here in his marriage to Roxanne, the Persian princess. And he conquered as far as the wondrous city Samarkand, where we went to visit in Uzbekistan. And he was there in about the 300s BCE. So now we have Zoroastrianism, we have this layer of Hellenistic culture. And Alexander is really revered there today. He's called Iskander. And it's an intriguing appropriation of him as belonging to Central Asia. So I found this very interesting. You can see these are actually modern mosaics. It's an entire room as big as the library, and the mosaics cover all the walls, and they trace his entire life in these mosaics. And they represent, as far as I could read it, the bond between Greek, Persian, and Central Asian cultures. And this made me wonder about how the Central Asian peoples are kind of drawing this line back, this Greek, to a Greek heritage, and is this a part of the project of creating a new national identity after the Soviet era, and maybe an attempt to align more with Greek or European roots than with Chinese? And so that was a question to me that I kind of lived with, and that we in our group talked about significantly. Alexander went to this beautiful lake, which is called Iskanderkul, or Lake Alexander. And this is the site of a legend of his famous horse. Remember Bucephalus? Well, Bucephalus apparently became ill at Iskanderkul and leaped off of a cliff into the waters and died. And he can still be seen there in the reflections, if you look closely. Besides which, it's really stunningly beautiful. Now, as the Silk Road developed, starting around the 200s BCE, the 2nd century BCE, Buddhism also spread into Central Asia. This is the largest clay sculpture in Central Asia, the Buddha on relying on the teachings. I think it's on the Eightfold Path. And so this region in which had been primarily Zoroastrian, in which they engaged in this worship through fire of Ahura Mazda, began to also include Buddhists. So now we have nomads practicing Tengrism. There are Zoroastrians and now also Buddhists. And that spread pretty widely until the 700 CE when Muslim Arabs arrived and the region, they swept into the region and they brought in Islam, which took about 200 years for that to really take root. But by about the 900s, most people had converted. Not everybody, but many people had converted to Islam. And it really, this culture, they established some of the most exciting centers of learning and science and art in the known world at the time. One of the people who is part of this is Omar Khayyam. He was a famed poet, maybe Sufi, not totally clear, and he penned his works here in this region. Then Genghis Khan, known by us as Genghis Khan, arrived in the 12th century, conquered and destroyed cities in his wake. Those who didn't surrender were really destroyed. And his heirs would go on to rule for hundreds of years afterwards. And for several centuries, if you were not of the line of Genghis Khan, you were not a legitimate ruler in this region. But it was not a unified region by any stretch. So this Mongol invasion led to a period of rebuilding. And Amir Timur emerged he's a national hero of Uzbekistan. He emerged in the late 1300s. He was actually not of the Khan family, but worked for the Khan family and then took over. And so he began this renaissance. He's a national hero, as I said, of Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan today. You can see him there. I'm saying hello to him. And he built a mausoleum, which I want to show you a little bit about. Now, this mausoleum, a mausoleum is so a mosque. If you think about a mosque as a temple, a mausoleum is like a tomb. Right? And so he built this mausoleum, Timur's mausoleum. In 1404, it was built very, very rapidly within about 2 years. And it would set the standard for mosques and mausoleums for hundreds of years and actually has a really significant architectural impact all the way into India and the Taj Mahal. So you can see this is Timur's mausoleum. And the inside, the dome is just breathtaking. And down in here, you can see these are, that black one, that's his tomb right there.
Where specifically is this?
This is in Samarkand. Yeah, so I'll come back and we'll look at, kind of chronologically through the cities, but that is where this is. And he also, his building and he really set up kind of an empire, and which is called the Timurid Empire. And his rule would lead to kind of this incredible burst of architectural glory, and it was funded by trade in silks, in spices, fruit, and also spices, big spice market, and horses, right? So the trade to South Asia was this north part of this north-south exchange in which Indians wanted horses and Central Asians wanted spices. And so that route, sorry, not spices, but silks. So it was a silk horse exchange going north-south. And you can see actually South Asian influence as well. You can see it in the bread, which is called naan. And you can see it in some of the styles of women. You can kind of see references that move across culturally. Now, in the Middle Ages, wealth accumulated in the cities, which were mostly ruled by these local khans, subjected to this Timurid family. And this continued until around the 19th century. Right, so now we've gone very rapidly. We've moved up into the 19th century. You know, 19th century is this era of colonialism. And the Russian Empire also engaged in colonialism. And they launched, this is a period in which they began to colonize Central Asia in part of what's known as the Great Game. So the Great Game was this maneuvering between Russian, Chinese, and also the British empires, and the British notably lost out in this region. So there's really very little British presence at this point. What we know today as the Stans had really not been defined at all as nations yet in the 19th century. They were grouped into a region that was called Turkestan, and it was just one big blob of Central Asian countries. It would take years for the Russians, such as this gentleman here, we're going to talk about him, to subdue the region. And Russian explorers, this gentleman here is named Przhevalsky. He would share with Russians his encounters in Central Asia. This really was unknown land for Russians and Europeans as well. And the Russian colonial experiment would leave Russian Orthodox Christianity in the region, and botanists would take back to Russia apples and pomegranate varieties of various sorts, as well, of course, as spices. So this is Przhevalsky, and he is most famously known for us with the horse. Right? This is the Przhevalsky horse. It's the one remaining wild horse. It was just reintroduced into Kazakhstan. There are really no wild horses. Now, we visited a museum to Przhevalsky, and then I took a picture of the map there, and it was not a very good picture. So I went online to look for a map. I could not find a map of Przhevalsky's. You can't find him. It's all about the horse. And then Julia said, well, let's just look in Russian. And so she looked in Russian, thank you, Julia. And she found the map, right? So it's all Russian language. And you can see here, if I can even find it, well, you can see here his trail. And he was trying to get to Lhasa. He was trying to get to Lhasa in Tibet. And he took about 5 different expeditions trying to get there. And he's really the first kind of non-Central Asian person to make these explorations. There were Chinese explorers who did come into the region, but he's kind of the first notable one who took this knowledge. Now, to the east, over beyond our map, the Chinese emperors at the time also took steps to secure their western borders by gradually swallowing the region that we today know as Xinjiang. Now, this is the home of the Uyghurs, this persecuted minority group up in Western China, and they are, it turns out, culturally and linguistically much closer to Tajiks or Kazakhs than they are to the Chinese. So their language is really not related to Mandarin, and culturally, if you looked at them, their costume and traditional way of living is much, much closer to Central Asians than it is to the Chinese. And we actually met some ethnic Uyghurs in Kyrgyzstan. So there are people who were able to cross the border before it closed down and who live in Central Asia. And we also met a group of people called the Dunhuang Chinese. And they, here's our remnant of Orthodox Christianity. This lady here, she's Dunhuang Chinese, Kyrgyz. And her family has been in Kyrgyzstan for 8 generations. They came in the late 19th century. They still speak a Chinese language, as well as Kyrgyz and Russian. So she and Lilia spoke in Russian to communicate with some Kyrgyz. And they identify themselves firmly as both Kyrgyz and Dunhuang. So again, it's so interesting how people see themselves in this multi-ethnic way, and yet they are still Kyrgyz. And she fed us this amazing dinner, and you can see, again, you can see a Chinese influence in the food. This lagman it crosses over from China into Central Asia. This is the noodles here. It's really good. Now, the Dunhuang also are Muslim, and this is a Dungan Chinese mosque in Kyrgyzstan. So you can see the Chinese influence with the flipped up corners of that roof. Now, in 1917, so we have until 1917, we have the Tsarist Russian influence and we have Chinese influence in this region. In 1917, the Russian Revolution led to the collapse of the empire, the Russian Empire, and the Bolsheviks took over in Moscow and in St. Petersburg, then known as Petrograd. Independent Soviets sprang up across the former empire, and in the Stans, a struggle ensued between several different groups. So there were modernizers, some of whom were religious and some who were secular. And they shared a desire for a national kind of pan-Stan identity. If you think about all these, this Turkestan region would all get united together in one modern nation. Then there were nationalists. The nationalists wanted separate nations based on more regional, ethnic, and linguistic identities. And then there were Bolsheviks. And the Bolsheviks were bent on bringing these further reaches of the Russian Empire under their control, and some of them were native Central Asians. They were convinced that this was the way forward. Now, according to legend, Stalin himself drew the lines of the nations once the Bolsheviks had secured control over the Stans, and he purged the hopeful intellectuals and nationalists. Now, the inside story appears to be that he worked with those Central Asian Bolsheviks to define what it meant to be Kyrgyz or Kazakh, and they tried to sort out the languages, which was complicated, and drew those national boundaries. So these became the new Soviet republics. These were Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan, the 5 stans. And they were declared Soviet republics and members of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in 1924. These are the borders that today separate these independent post-Soviet stans. And the Soviet stamp is all over them. I was especially intrigued by these remnants, as well as places where this part of this complex history has just been wiped away. So you see these different responses in the post-Soviet era to their past. Now, the Soviets did achieve some significant social change, such as they got rid of a very, very intense burqa-style dress that women had been required to wear, and I'll show you a photo of that later because we actually got to try one on. But the Soviet rule also took a significant toll on many groups, and it's important to recognize this kind of dual heritage, I think. Now, during the Soviet era, we have on the one hand the memorial to the revolution. Note, this is not World War I, this is to the Bolshevik Revolution. They also experienced World War II, and World War II proved pivotal in binding the Soviet citizens all over together as part of one whole. So Kazakh and Kyrgyz troops were drafted, and they were called on to defend Moscow and served side by side with people from all over the Soviet Union. So next are Ukrainians, Belarusians, Russians, Latvians, and so on. And some people during this time were moved by force into Central Asia as well. So Koreans in the areas that were being taken over by the Japanese in Asia, they actually were kind of internally deported into Kazakhstan, and they were relocated by the Soviets. And at the same time, the privations that had been imposed on Central Asia, which would include the very brutal political purges of that young nationalist movement in the 1920s, and then a terrible famine, a massive 1930s era famine that decimated herders in Kazakhstan, as well as farmers in Uzbekistan, and which really is seen particularly by Kazakhs as a form of genocide in the 1930s, that faded somewhat into memory because World War II refugees, internally displaced persons come into Central Asia from the rest of the Soviet Union, and they pour in. The Central Asians are going to defend the borders of the Soviet Union with their fellow Soviet citizens. And one other significant change during World War II is that as the Germans invaded Eastern Europe, the Soviets picked up their munitions and industries from Eastern Europe and moved them, guess where? Yes, to Central Asia. So they picked up, airplane factories and they moved them into Uzbekistan. So by the end of the war, Central Asians had come to identify themselves as Soviet citizens in an increasingly, and now at least in popular memory, largely harmonious and immensely diverse society. And this is memorialized in that World War II memorial, which we'll come back to. Now, the relative calm of the Brezhnev era in the 1960s, those of you who remember your Cold War history, saw a wave of building, the goal of free, albeit ugly, housing for all seemed within reach. And that was something that people really talked about, was this memory of having, that everybody had housing. There is now, in Central Asia, a housing shortage. Industry was also rumbling along. Cotton farming had really taken hold, particularly in Uzbekistan, and its horrific environmental impact, which includes the draining of the Aral Sea, which is a huge environmental disaster, had not yet become evident. People had work, they had a sense of identity, and again, at least in popular memory, they had a unified sense of purpose. And we can see this, for example, when a disastrous earthquake struck Tashkent, Uzbekistan in 1966. People from all over the Soviet Union flooded in, traveled in to help rebuild, and this monument here memorializes that, and it tells the story of the rebuilding of the city with the men and women who came in response to the 26th of April, I think it is, 1966. Am I right? April? Yes. She's my Russian chick. Okay. So Central Asians that we spoke with remember themselves as far enough from the center at this time to have a measure of freedom that was maybe different than people who were closer to Moscow and closer to kind of a more intensive control, which again was kind of interesting to me and was sort of verified again and again in various studies. Now, after 1992, when the Velvet Revolution in Europe occurred, the Soviet Union finally collapsed with the Stans kind of peeling off and breaking away. And so each country has been now engaged in this building of a national identity building project. And so this raised many questions for me. How do people form a national identity? Who gets to decide what the identity means, and who is included? How do public monuments and memorials reflect public memory? So these are all questions that I felt help me think about also what it means to be American. And the politics of the region after 1992, they followed a kind of a similar pattern in each country with some variation. And here Megan gets some credit. She pointed this out to me in her paper last year. And so former Communist Party leaders declared their independence from the USSR, and they reinvented themselves as capitalist strongmen and proceeded to rule for decades. More recently, there has been some progress. Kyrgyzstan has taken to overthrowing the unbearably corrupt in popular uprisings. They had one in 2005 called the Tulip Revolution, and in 2010. And this monument here represents that. Now, Lilia, our tour guide, anticipates another popular uprising because the current president is so corrupt. And he actually, I think, was in prison for a while. And you can see here, this represents pushing away the darkness of the past in order to allow something new to emerge. This is right in their central square. Uzbekistan, their president, so-called president, died, and the new one has focused on tourism and on trying to open up. And while Tajikistan, which is the one country that suffered an actual violent and protracted civil war in the 1990s, remains firmly in the iron grip of our president, as all call him. His ubiquitous portrait hovers over buildings, public squares, and people's homes in a modern cult of personality. His he's even attributed with donating 8 million books to the National Library. This is the National Library, which is supposed to represent an open book. You can see here the opening of the book. And although actually the story is that each family in Tajikistan was required to give a book from their own personal library to the president, who then donated them to this library and got all the credit. There is a special room. This library, by the way, was utterly empty of people when we were in there. And it made me wonder about who was allowed to use it and access it. It just floor after floor of echoing empty rooms. We saw maybe 4 children in the children's library. And there's a whole exhibit, a little hard to see here, but you might notice that the picture on every book is our president. There's a whole exhibit about his contributions. So now you have a little bit of a sense of this region, and now I want to show you our journey that we took. So we flew into Bishkek, okay? That's in Kyrgyzstan. And we're going to look at this little loop here up to Sati village, and then we cross over into Kazakhstan. So we're going to just look at this region in here first. So our first stop, Kyrgyzstan, most clearly shows the Soviet stamp still. You can see building styles and you can figure out when they were built based on their style. So you have Russian Empire, so that would be Russian Empire style. And then you have Soviet control, right? And then post-Soviet era, and I'll show you some of those as well. This is also Soviet. The key here, look on the roof. You can see the 5-pointed star. And great, classic, I love this building, classic kind of modernist Soviet building. Murals that celebrate the workers remain. And the bus stops, which were designed by Soviet-era art students, this was their final project in art school, they also remain, although they are slowly being dismantled, which is really kind of tragic. But there is a book about them, which I did not see while I was there, so I couldn't get. But you can see here figures out of the workers, right, working, but there's also cultural references here. They're at a circus, but here you can see them around the tea. You can see the tea and the naan and the bowls of tea, and a typical Kyrgyz instrument there as well. There is actually one bus stop. If you look at this gentleman's hat, he's waiting for the bus. There's a bus stop that's shaped like the hat as well, but I did not manage to get a picture. Now, in Kyrgyzstan, World War II is also memorialized with Soviet grandeur in central locations as well as in small towns. Every small town has its own monument. And this you can see here, this is a monument to the friendship of the Soviet peoples, and the big stalks in the middle represent, I think, wheat and prosperity. But there's also this evocation of a national hero. This is Manas, who is a little bit like Odysseus. And there's a huge epic with, I think, 100,000 lines of verse that the singers of Manas are revered. And so you see monuments to them. This is the first singer to memorize the entire thing and maybe write it down. And so these are kind of in the front, in the central plazas. But Lenin is still there. If you can see, that's Lenin. He remains, he's tucked away around the corner now. He's been moved. And Stalin is gone. Stalin has been dismantled. And of course, there were sculptures of Stalin. Bishkek itself feels like a well-planned city, fallen a bit maybe on hard times. And it has this intriguing mix of feeling sort of Eastern European and uniquely Central Asian elements. There are tree-lined streets. They're irrigated by ditches. You can see the ditches here on the side with these tubes that go in to water the trees. This was designed by the Soviets, and it was intended to funnel glacial water from the mountains to the trees, but that water is lower than it used to be. The city's really green. There are public places to picnic in. Families were out enjoying their green spaces. Kyrgyzstan is also terribly poor, but it has universities here in Bishkek, and it has a very wide variety of landscape. And so it's got, Bishkek has these universities and mountains, and then it has these verdant valleys and incredibly beautiful national parks. And so we actually spent quite a lot of time hiking in the landscape. And so I'm going to show you some of those places as well. It's quite high up. The elevation was high. It was a struggle. I was out of breath a lot. So this is the Valley of the Flowers. People having their summer vacations in their yurt in the park. And then this was I think these are called the Seven Bowls, and you have these big red formations it's kind of like the Southwest. There I am. There I am actually painting, and you can see one of the paintings over there if you want to look. I tried to journal by painting as well. These flooded valleys. This was an earthquake caused this beautiful lake to appear. And there's our group again. This is called the Little Grand Canyon, they call it. It has another name as well, but that's how they Charo Canyon, I think it's called. Now, so we did all this hiking through those places until we then drove up over a giant mountain pass. You can see it was about 13,000 foot mountain pass. There was snow up at the top. We had a snowball fight, and then we went to our yurt camp. And here is the family that hosted us. They did not speak any English, but this is their summer work. And those photos of the children playing, that's this yurt camp. Then we came down off of the yurt camp and went to a little village where we visited a Soviet-era spa, sanatoriy, right there. And there I appreciated, I think she might have been a cosmonaut, this sculpture here. But it was designed actually for the cosmonauts, and Yuri, the first one, what was his name? Gagarin. He was here, right? He went here to recover. And then it got opened up, and all sorts of people could go. You got 2 free weeks if you were Soviet citizen. Now, and then we went on to a UNESCO cultural preservation site, and there were several of these that we went to, and so I grouped them together for you. And so their idea is cultural preservation. So we learned felt making with these women here, and you lay out the felt on the wool, and then you water it and you soap it, and you roll it up, and then you dance on it. So we had to all dance. They turned the music on, and we all danced. It was really fun. And there's the finished product. Then they demonstrated a traditional Kyrgyz method of felting, in which you cut out 2 pieces, and then you use the positive and the negative. So you'll see that. You can see how you lay them out together. These are very traditional patterns as well. And then they're sewn together, and then the final result looks like that. Then we went to visit a place where a man is developing ways of using traditional weaving with new techniques, and he gave us a weaving lesson. And there's the strap on Julia's bag over there that's from this place. That bag is from this place. Then we went and we learned how to build a yurt. The yurts were the portable housing of the nomads. And so they have no nails in them. And so we learned the whole technique of building the yurt. And I'll just show you what that looked like. And you can see the wool felt that makes the walls. This thing around here on the edge, it kind of expands out. And then, but you can see it's all wooden pegs, like there's no metal on these. When you tie the stakes together, you put the top rafters on. You tie those up, unroll the walls, unroll this mat, the reed mats. There's, you can see the straps that the man was making. And then this, of course, represents the crown of heaven, the center of the yurt. And that's, you see that it's on the Kyrgyz flag. It's all over as a symbol. And there's our finished yurt. The Kyrgyz proudly, I believe, beat the Kazakhs in the international yurt building competition at the Central Asian Olympic Games. Very, very competitive. So,
how long does it take to build it? Like
it took us, so I think they won in like 42 minutes or something. Yeah, it took us, I don't know, an hour and 15, but they knew exactly what they were doing and just bossed us around. Yeah. So we now then went up here and we drove across the border to Almaty, which is in Kazakhstan. So we crossed into Kazakhstan, no recognizable border, not really any significance to the crossing, and but it was a long drive. So it's really, Kazakhstan is the 9th largest country in the world by land mass, but it has one of the lowest population densities. There are only 16 people per square mile. So it's really one of the emptiest countries in the world. And it felt enormous. The steppe was huge, and we drove for hours and hours. And then we got to Almaty. Now Almaty, which is not the capital, but it's a city of 2.3 million people. It's a lovely city. This is their airport. And it is, its name means apple or father of apples. And it's full of development. It's growing rapidly, rapid population growth. You can see there's lots of development. And this is a university. And it is a city that is full also of green spaces. It also feels quite livable. Which, contrary to what I had thought before, was a Soviet objective, was to build livable cities. So again, I had a lot of preconceived notions that were kind of dismantled. This was also, Almaty was also the military headquarters of the Russian Empire. So before the Soviets, Russian military control. You can see here, this was some office in the military. And it's quite, you can see this Russian stamp on it also because there is a major Russian Orthodox cathedral here. Almaty is diverse. It has ethnic Russians, Germans, Koreans, and many other ethnicities that all live side by side. And in ancient times, it was a major stop on the Silk Roads. But this cathedral is like a Russian folly. You can see the architect had a lot of fun with this cathedral. And let me just show you the inside too. It's very, very colorful. And there was actually a service going on in it with chanting. And there's a Madonna. I thought it was an interesting Madonna. Now, the Kazakhs were part of that defense of Moscow in World War II, and Almaty has a huge monument. That's where this monument is. It has an eternal flame burning, and it's this huge monument in the heart of Almaty. There, and you can see here these figures of, these are it's called the Panfilov. It was the group of defenders of Moscow during the Second World War. Their capricious former president, whose gold handprint here is on their monument to independence, it renamed their capital, so not Almaty, but what is now Astana, named it after himself, and then he died, and now luckily the capital has gone back to being called Astana. But his handprint is on this monument, and you can his as well as a portrait of him with his glorious accomplishments as our required tour guide told us. So that the government remains fairly authoritarian. We had to have an official local guide who told us the script, And she was and didn't well that much because Lelia kept correcting her under her breath. So. But she pointed out, this is our president with his glorious accomplishments. We were only in Almaty 3 days, but it felt like a very vibrant, modern city. My father's film is actually in a film festival there right now, so wish I could go and see that too, but I would go back anytime. So then we flew from Almaty to Dushanbe, Tajikistan. We flew over these mountains. We had to leave Lelia behind because Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are involved in some kind of border dispute, and Tajikistan won't issue visas to Kyrgyz people right now. I also suspect that Lelia is too outspoken and would get herself in trouble there. Now, this is the one country, Tajikistan. So we're flying from Almaty here by plane, crossing over into Tajikistan. So here's Tajikistan, right? And Tajikistan borders Afghanistan and also China. So here we flew to Dushanbe. And Tajikistan is the one country that had this very complex civil war. It was extensive and violent after the Soviets fell. And their president today reputedly promised peace, which people say, oh, well, yes, he delivered on that. It has persisted, but it is a palpably authoritarian state. People watch what they say, and they never criticize our president. The war itself was quite complicated. There were rebels and Islamists and nationalists and outside forces, and they were all in conflict. And this is the one place, in Dushanbe, where we saw evidence. This is the central square. We saw evidence of an armed society. But Dushanbe itself is kind of like Vegas in Central Asia. The downtown has been totally rebuilt, and it's all using white granite. And at night, it lights up like Disney World, as you can see. And the next day, Xi Jinping was going to be there. And notably, there were all sorts of flags. Doesn't show that, but you can see the Chinese flag right here. And I was struck, particularly in Tajikistan, by the absolute absence of any, like in the hotels, no American flag. Right? All the other flags would be up there. No American flags. So interesting. So interesting. We clearly, there is not an American presence. So it's like Disney World. People come out. It's unbearably hot during the day. It was over 100 degrees. It's very dry also. So it was really very unpleasant during the day. And this is when people come out. There were kids out as well. And they also water their trees at night. That you can see, this was the Soviet era channel, but now they just dump water on it like that. It didn't seem very efficient. There is, by the way, a worldwide marble shortage, white marble shortage, because of the Tajiks and Turkmenistan's building efforts to rebuild their center of their city. The poor are gone. There are no poor people in the center of Dushanbe. Women clean the streets, and there are very few men in the day to be seen. We wondered if men might be working in the mines or perhaps in Russia, where they have become migrant workers and send remittances home. This is something many Tajik people have resorted to. Now, 2 weeks before we arrived, the Tajik parliament has passed a bill banning the hijab. Now, the hijab is the religious head covering. And this had been passed in the wake of a terrorist attack in Russia by radicalized expat Tajiks. So Tajiks they're not particularly religious when they're at home in Tajikistan. They go to Russia, they become radicalized, and they launch this terrorist attack. And then Tajikistan responded by passing this ban on the hijab. And Tajikistan has an avowedly secular state. They say repeatedly, we are not a religious state, and they do not allow the call to prayer. It's forbidden in Tajikistan. And so they designated the hijab as foreign, but there were all these women wearing headscarves. So we tried to figure out what this meant. And they said, well, traditional Tajik headscarves are permitted, but not the hijab. Now, I also don't think it had quite gone into effect yet. But you can see here these women wearing these scarves. That's kind of traditional. And this one might be a hijab, and I'll show you a picture in a second of another, a definite hijab, clearly a hijab. So I was trying to capture that distinction, but maybe not fully successful. Now, I did get to have dinner with Nika. Yes. She was our exchange student and classmate of these guys here. So, and she is doing, she's a student in Cyprus. She goes to university.
Cyprus?
Cyprus. Yes. Now, our tour guide, oh, this is what we had for dinner. It was really good. Our tour guide in Tajikistan was Dilnosa, and she was a young woman, 24 years old, and she has a sister who is trained as a nurse, and the sister is married to a man who went to Russia to work, I think, in construction, and she works as a waitress in Russia and sends home remittances, money, and Dilnosa and her sister support their parents. They are Ismaili, which is a different kind of subdivision of Islam, and they're subsistence farmers from the mountains near Afghanistan. So they're very, very poor, the family is. And Dilnosa keeps her younger brother in school by paying for his school fees. Her father is a diabetic, he's disabled, and her mother keeps the small farm holding running. She described, it was interesting, she described a more open society amongst the Ismaili community. Ismaili women do not cover their heads. Men and women pray together in the mosque, although they are on different sides of the mosque. And clearly her parents value education. She has a boyfriend back home, and so it was interesting to have this interaction with her. She's speaking here. She's this. Sorry. She's speaking here under a monument to the founder of the Persian language, and Tajik. The language Tajik is Persian, whereas all the other Central Asian languages are Turkic. So they're not Chinese, they're not Russian, but they are mostly Turkic. And so Tajiks and others can't actually speak to one another in their native language, they speak to one another in Russian. And you can also see the Zoroastrian symbols up here of the sun light. Now, before we left Dushanbe, we visited this major new mosque. It was built by the Qataris. And we went into this mosque. This is one of the times I really found it hard to deal with the treatment of women. The doorkeepers inspected each woman. It was very, very beautiful. But they made us put on what we call the robe of shame if they showed so much as an ankle. So this was the only skirt I could find in my entire closet that I thought would be appropriate. And it did work because it went all the way to the floor. But Dilnosa was not appropriately attired, and they made her put that robe on. And then this would be a hijab. And so she then was appropriately dressed. So here she is. And the mosque provided this. Now, some of the men occasionally would get, if they wore shorts, they would have to wear a skirt of shame too. So that always felt very satisfying to do. All right. Now, directly outside of Dushanbe, the poverty of Tajikistan, which is one of the poorest countries in the world, became evident. Mines burrow into the hillside, and you can't actually tell if these are residences for people or where they keep their animals. The roads, well, depend. If they're Chinese, they're great, and that is an avalanche protection that the Chinese built. Iranian roads, maybe not so good. Try 5 kilometers in the dark on an unfinished, unpaved road through a mountain. That was the Iranian one. It was a little wild. But you can see the appeal of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. The Chinese are building roads here, and you can actually get places on them, which is kind of a novelty. The Soviet touch is mostly gone. These are all modern mines, so-called modern. We did see some heavy equipment. But with the exception of this is the one Soviet-era mural I saw in Tajikistan, and it's on this shuttered factory here. You can see the red star. Now, so we stayed in in a tiny village here in, and the name has gone out of my head, but I can look for it for you. And it was a guest house, And here were our hosts. They were lovely, a lovely family who fed us and took care of us. And even here in this remote place, there's our president. They watched it. He watched it. So while we were here, this was our view out the window. And we hiked up to an even more remote village, past the donkeys. I love the donkeys. And this was a place, we had to cross this rather rickety bridge, and we went up to this tiny little settlement up on the mountain. And women and children were here. Again, no men in evidence. I don't know if they were working the mines, maybe. And they didn't speak English, so we couldn't really ask them. And they were making yogurt and kefir and butter. So here they're straining the yogurt. And we tried some. It was really good. And that's where they make the butter. It's big. It's about this big round. And they fed us this sort of cheese from the top of the butter. And there are the children talking with us. And they seem to stay up there for the summer. That's where they go for the summer. And they tend their cows. And they have a donkey there. And on our way back down, there were some locals who made us stop and come and share their collected melon and some naan. It was, again, very good collected melon. And our bus driver who went up there also tried to get on the child's donkey, who then promptly knocked the bus driver off and galloped off. This is a donkey, a baby donkey. So the Tajik government, as I said, has made this concerted effort to wipe out the Soviet past. There are no murals, there are not sculptures honoring the proletariat or the Soviet forces. And the border, interestingly, is very much like a Cold War border. We crossed the border to Uzbekistan by hiking. We had to take all of our gear, carry it with us. It was 100 degrees again. And I kid you not, it was actually 100 degrees. And we had to walk across this long border. In some places, it's like 3 miles, and you have to pay somebody to drive you across it. But here it was the shortest border that we could do. It's heavily armed. We were inspected. We were searched. They questioned us. It was somewhat alarming, I have to say. And I did not take any photos of this crossing. And finally, we were welcomed back to Uzbekistan. So here now we are crossing here and back to the waiting arms of Lilia. And we made our way then to Tashkent in Uzbekistan. So Tashkent Uzbekistan in general is the most populated of these Central Asian countries. And we would visit one modern city, which is Tashkent, and 3 ancient cities, Samarkand, Bukhara, and Khiva. And we stopped in between at a desert yurt camp in Irkul. So I'll show you that as well. Now, Tashkent is tremendous fun. They have a great dumpling shop with dumplings from all over the world. They were really good. They had cherry-filled dumplings, which we keep trying to replicate. And the most beautiful subway system I've ever seen. It had all sorts of interesting new architecture, and it has universities. You can see here. It's a center of education. There are 220 universities and schools, and they're highly literate, 99.9% literacy in the city. And there were millions of Soviet rubles that were spent to being invested in education. And actually, interestingly, after the Soviet collapse, all of the people in the cities couldn't speak the local languages. They could only speak Russian. And so that was, interesting side. The Soviets were so proud. Here you can see this is the Uzbekistan Republic. This is a new building, Ministry of Energy. The Soviets were so proud of this educational effort that they built this big modernist building that, again, is supposed to look like an open book. Now, you might notice that it says Hotel Uzbekistan. They are switching over into the the Roman alphabet instead of moving away from Cyrillic, but you still see Cyrillic. Now, before 2016, Uzbekistan was sort of a military state. Police and military checkpoints everywhere, apparently, closed borders. And then their president, the last president, his name was Islam Karimov, who had ruled since 1992, died. And the next president kind of opened it up a lot. There is persistent corruption. Karama's daughter is a prime example. She had a falling out with her father right towards the end and was convicted then later of fraud and money laundering and is on a U.S. sanctions list. She's, at the time, was considered one of the 10 wealthiest women in the world and currently is under house arrest. So you can see kind of how this corruption persists, but it is, they are making progress towards tourism. Tajikistan was a center for modernist architecture, and Tashkent was, and it was largely destroyed in this 1966 earthquake that I referred to earlier. And according to local lore, people came, this is their subway system. People came from all over to rebuild, and then they stayed because they liked it so much, because it's such a lovely city. Now, the Soviets also built this absolutely gorgeous subway system in honor of the cosmonauts and other Central Asian heroes. And there you can see a cosmonaut. Just beautiful. And it worked really well, too. So this is all the subway system. That one is a particular favorite of mine, this station. Yeah. Now, in Uzbekistan, we also saw some of the most amazing Islamic sites and architecture. And so we went from Tashkent to Samarkand. And you should know that under the Soviets, all of the mosques, so the Islamic temples, the madrasas, which are Islamic schools, they were all closed. And only in World War II were they allowed to reopen. Maybe the thinking was people take comfort in religion and then they go fight, which seemed to work pretty well. But the official committee oversaw them, and they had really quite strict control over them. And you can still see that control in this sort of avowed secular stance of the government, and they clearly fear radicalization. In Uzbekistan, the single madrasa that was in all of Central Asia that was allowed to operate through the Soviet time was in Tashkent. It was government approved, and today in Uzbekistan, madrasas are approved by the state as well. So we left Tashkent, we went to famed Samarkand, which Alexander reputedly visited. And the mosques and madrasas are just stunning. This is, again, Timur's mausoleum. And you can see here how beautiful work is. This is in the heart of Samarkand. It's maybe the most famous place. It's called Registan. And there are 3 huge madrasas with a mosque in them that are built around this square. So these 3 buildings, they're separate madrasas, separate schools. And you can see a little bit more of what one looks like. Now, we then left Samarkand for Bukhara, but we stopped in the desert. Again, it was horribly hot. And we visited a yurt camp. We stayed at yurt camp. That's what it was like inside. And we also were treated to some traditional Uzbek music. I just went. Desert. We went to Bukhara. And Bukhara is a center for arts and crafts. Many of the things that I brought back are from Bukhara. And we shopped for silks. And this is a trading, they had these trading domes, and each trading dome had its own unique designation. So the silk weavers would be in one, and the money changers would be in another, money lenders. And so we did a lot of shopping in Bukhara. And we shopped for silks, and some of us shopped for carpets, and we watched women weaving them. We went shopping for knives and stork scissors. There were storks and bread stamps. And this is, I have a little stork scissors here. These were like that big. So, and we even got to try on the traditional women's covering that women would have worn before the Soviet era. And you can see how intense it was. That's actually someone standing in there. She's actually wearing it. So you really can't see anything of her. And this was required until the Soviets banned it in like the late 20s or early 30s. And what they did was they got the local leaders to go out and unveil their women in public. Many of those women were then murdered because people responded so much outrage. So there's a whole sort of history of that, the unveiling of the women, and how violent that is. Now, Bukhara, as I said, was a trading post, and it had a dome for each different type of trader. It also had a large Jewish community, which existed there until independence. One dome, the one I showed you earlier, was for the Jewish merchants. And locals say that Jews and Muslims actually worshipped together in the same temple for a while, and they emphasized this largely harmonious relationship that they had. I met a young Muslim girl who proudly told me she attends the Jewish school. And then I said, "Oh, are you Jewish?" She said, "Oh, no, I am Muslim. There are only 20 Jewish students in the school of 500. There was a big exodus after it opened up. Sadly, the synagogue actually in Bukhara was closed when I tried to visit it. I kept missing their open times. I don't know. It was definitely not what was posted. But we did actually get to have dinner in a home that had belonged to a Jewish family. And this is the house. And this family was, you can see here, it's now owned by not a Jewish family. But these families would live kind of discreetly because sometimes they were forced to convert. So it's not clear to me if this is a mihrab, which is the niche that points the direction towards Mecca in Muslim households, or if this is actually pointing towards Jerusalem. That was not totally clear, and we had kind of different stories about how Jews were trying to hide their identity, which they were. This house had been collectivized by the Soviets, so they confiscated it from the family, and all the artwork had been painted over, and it's only in the process now of being restored. So you can see the beautiful ceiling. The ceiling had all been covered, and all the Jewish markers had been hidden, kind of the Jewish identity markers. The family itself had fled to Tajikistan, and I don't know any more about that. So. I want to tell you about two other kinds of places we visited before I end. One is a caravansary, which I'll come to in a minute, and also I want to tell you just about Ulugh Bek. And Ulugh Bek was an astronomer in the 1300s and 1400s, and he developed a calendar that was accurate to within 1 minute and 10 seconds of our modern calendar, the solar year. Incredible. He had an observatory which is mostly destroyed, but this remains, and this was this sort of curved swoop of stairs, and they would go down there, and there were holes in the top where the sunlight would come in, and that's how they got their measurements to measure the length of the year. Just stunning. He's considered to be as great an astronomer, certainly in the ranks of Galileo and Kepler. So the other place I wanted to show you were caravansaries. So you can see caravansarai. And unfortunately, there are only remnants of these. These were, this was like an inn for people on the Silk Roads. And so every 20 miles, there would be a caravansary, and your caravan could stop and stay there. They could put you up. They would feed you. They had a little mosque. They could take your camels, and your stuff could stay there as well. But before you were allowed to go in the city, if you were a merchant, you had to go to baths. This is the caravansary. And then you had to stop, and you were forced to go to the bath, the hammam. These are remnants of the hammam. And they were trying to prevent the spread of disease. So interesting. We actually went to a hammam in Bukhara. It was from the 1600s. It had been built like in the 1600s, and it was really, I've never been scrubbed and so clean in my entire life. And the menfolk went as well. And if you're interested, you should watch Anthony Bourdain's visit to Uzbekistan, because it's really quite an experience. Apparently, it's a little bit more energetic than the women's hammam. But
I can attest to that.
yes, and these are really intense ones. I think they might even be more intense than the Turkish ones. So, yeah. So it was. I can tell you more about it. So our last stop was Khiva. Khiva is a 2,500-year-old walled city. It's a World Heritage Site, and it is an incredible place. No cars are allowed in the inner city. It's a walled city, and we stayed in a former madrasa. So we each had our own little cell. Well, with my roommate, I had a cell. Each door leads into our little cell. And it really felt like a medieval world. But it had these lovely modern amenities like running water and things like that. We saw traditional dancing and music. And I have a clip of that as well for you. And so we were in a rooftop restaurant here, and we got to see this. Sorry, I can't quite figure out how to make it. Go to the next one here. And we have another one here, very, very short. They were so cute, those ones. So, interestingly, especially for us from Pennsylvania, it turns out there was a German Mennonite community in Khiva, and there's a little museum to them funded by the Germans, and with people there who were carpenters and fine woodworkers and farmers, and they actually, the Mennonites, built the bed that the Khan slept in with his harem. I found ironic. When I laughed out loud, they're like, well, why do you think that's so funny? And I explained why I thought it was so funny, but I was amused. And so the Khan had this room, and it was in his courtyard, and all the women were their own rooms around him. And if he put his hat on the door, it meant he was occupied. That would be our leader, Patrick's hat. Now, I loved Khiva, and mostly I was entranced by this car-free old city. It feels like it's out of another time. Its walls withstood the onslaught of Genghis Khan. It was taken by the Russian Empire, and in part, this was because that they were involved in kidnapping Russians and selling them into slavery. And it turns out that both Khiva and Bukhara had major slave markets, and there's no college at all. So I thought that was also really interesting. But they have endured. They endured the Soviet era, and today we can still walk those walls and even hold them up. Now, before I close, because some of you might be feeling like this, I would like to thank the National Consortium for Teaching About Asia, G-Tours, who are the tour agency, and their subdivision GEO, which specializes in working with educators. They're actually based in Philadelphia. I recommend them highly. I'd like to thank the University of Pittsburgh, Cambridge and Waldorf School for their support, also my father, Dick Blau, and of course my husband, who supports my adventuring and holds down the fort as a single parent, not as a bachelor, while I'm away. Also, thank you to my children who send me off, even though I know they miss me and they worry about me and they have to feed my husband. And I hope that they will also adventure. I invite you to look at some of the items I brought back with you. Now, I could not bring you any of the communist ice cream, Fine. I love that. Or of the butt coin. But please try some Quart, which is a cheese curd that is shelf stable and ubiquitous at rest stops and at markets. It's really powerful, so you might not want to take a whole piece, but I'm going to cut off just a tiny taste. Just saying. Also appreciate, I've got spices, the bread stamps, Quran holder, silks, ikat, which is cotton weaving. There's chai, tea, black, as I was told. And thank you so much for your attention and your interest, and as they say throughout Central Asia, Ahmad. Many of you may want to go, but if you have questions, I'm happy to answer questions, but feel free if you feel like you need to go.
Attention of the